Thanks, everybody. And I'm just reflecting on the presence of lasagna, as Jim mentioned, in Serra events. This is a story I hadn't thought about in quite some time. When I was in real deep discernment for the priesthood, I was still working in the energy world as a directional driller, MWD, and a lot of the work I did was in North Texas in a formation called the Barnett Shale. And by that point, I was a newly minted Roman Catholic, but very active in the faith, and looking at the goings on of the diocese I was visiting at the time, which was several in Texas, but at that point was in the Diocese of Fort Worth. They had on the calendar a Serra event for any young man who was considering a call to the priesthood or the religious life. So not really knowing a thing about the Serra Club, I signed up for it, showed up out of nowhere. Was not a parishioner in any Fort Worth parish for the diocese. All I knew is they were talking about vocations and they had a free meal. And it was lasagna. As somebody who was on a 24-hour stint on a rig, no food, no rest, it was absolutely delicious. And afterwards, with the hustle and bustle of rig life, I never got around to writing a thank you note to that Serra Club in Fort Worth. So to Serra International for that free meal, thank you very, very much. Where I came from in Oklahoma, for the most part, we were oil fields, so we traveled around a bit. My father and his father were both in the oil patch. Catholicism was very deeply rooted, but a very small part of the population. This is pretty common throughout our part of the nation. So the famous stories of the priests who really brought the faith to that part of Stevens County, really it comes from the missionaries from Europe, specifically Belgium. They would come down on the train, which would parallel or become US Highway 81. They would get off the train in Marlow, where there was a small nascent Catholic community. The priest would set up an altar literally next to the train tracks because he couldn't stay for very long, setting up the different parts of the altar which needed to be present. And then as he finally vested, the very last thing he placed on the altar was a 6-shooter peacemaker. It was a dangerous time to be a Catholic, let alone a Catholic priest, in this part of what was then Indian Territory. There has never been a resident priest in my home parish, Immaculate Conception in Marlow. It has always been served either by visiting priests from various international locations, or more recent decades has been served by the local pastor at Assumption Catholic Church in Duncan. Duncan at one time had 4 or 5 missions attached to it, so their weekend schedule was absolutely crazy, and they've since pared that down a bit, making some difficult decisions. The parish in Ryan was recently closed, parish in Eureka, I think, and others have changed hands, and now our own Father John Paul is managing the parish in Walters. Is that St. Patrick's as well? St. Patrick's and Walters is now in the care of Sacred Heart. So from that, having no full-time priestly presence in Marlow, we have produced exactly 2 priests, one standing before you and Father Wade Darnall of happy memory. He was ordained immediately after the Second World War, after several years in seminary himself. Now, he was a divisional commander, if memory serves me correct. This was not a low-level soldier who served in the European theater. He came in with a good deal of experience and know-how. And he is more famous having served as pastor in the parish in Frederick for a number of years. And the famous story with him is that he worked with a person on the parish council who, by all accounts, was a very difficult man to get along with, was very disagreeable, and who let his opinions be known very well. One day, this man came to the priest's residence at the rectory and confronted him about something in a very non-friendly way. And finally, Father Wade Darnall had enough, reared back, and he punched the man as hard as he could. He always would say how he regretted his overreaction, but again, just based on word from the locals, if you talk to anybody from Frederick who were aware of the situation, they'll be the first to tell you the guy probably had it coming anyways. So from being there in Marlow, having a little bit of that Catholic history is something I'm very proud of. But strangely enough, I wasn't raised Roman Catholic. We didn't stay in Marlow for too long. We arrived there in 1989. But my family had always been active in the United Methodist Church, at least my immediate family. Other extended family are predominantly Southern Baptist and First Christian Disciples of Christ. Growing up, the Catholic Church was always kind of present, but we didn't know so much about it, and I absolutely was very ignorant to most things Catholic. My only exposure was things through media. I finished school and go off to Texas A&M, where both my father and his father went to. You can see a pattern in my life. But it was there I really began to encounter Roman Catholic students who were not just knowledgeable of their faith, they were very active, very much doing things for their faith. And it was an incredible time to be at a campus ministry. For us specifically, things were going so well for the Catholic Student Center at Texas A&M. The pastor for most of my time as a student there was Father Mike Siss, and then so for most of my undergraduate, I was not Catholic, and by then I had kind of stepped away from the United Methodist Church. They, throughout the late 90s and early 2000s, were grappling with many of the issues that most mainstream liberal Protestant denominations are coping with. And many of their decisions, I felt, even as knowledgeable but slightly distancing United Methodist, I had real concerns with, specifically areas concerning life and morals and ethics. So by the time I was in college, I was kind of ripe for something, although I wasn't sure what. So enter a young woman into my life who was Catholic, but faith and Mass attendance were not high on her priority. I did convince her, once we started dating, to take me to my very first Catholic Mass. So this was the Student Center, serving the students at A&M. And I had no idea what was going on. It was my first time, I think, really to lay eyes on a priest. And his actions were just so different from what I'd seen in the movies. So I was asking this young woman I was seeing at the time, what's he doing now? What's with the washing of the hands? And she couldn't answer a thing. But by that point, I began to get plugged in to the Catholic students at Texas A&M. I already had a friend. I was a cadet for 4 years at A&M. If you see the college football spread, you'll notice at the A&M games several of these students wearing a very distinctive uniform, particularly members of the marching band. These are all members of a student organization called the Corps of Cadets, which has one of its purposes is to prepare young men and women for service as officers in the armed forces. So I was discerning that at the time. My freshman year, September 11th happened, so things got a little interesting as far as those going off to serve in various theaters, and good friends of mine never made it back. And so as someone who was anticipating a military career, very suddenly it wasn't so appetizing to me, and instead I began to look more deeply at the Catholic Church, because by then, I just started RCI, so this is late 2004. By then, I became aware of what vocations were understood to be in the Catholic Church, which is very different from many other denominations, and that great work was being done on campus, supporting young men and women going off both to diocesan seminaries and to the religious life in all manners of areas. So the conversations we'd have amongst ourselves as students, even at that point when I was in RCIA, was, did you hear about so-and-so? He's off to join the novitiate for the Society of Jesus. Did you hear about so-and-so? He's off to the diocesan seminary, going to study for the Diocese of Dallas. Who would have thought? Or did you hear about the one young man who was an aerospace engineering major, made it to his senior year, stood up in the middle of class, walked out, joined the Franciscan Friars, the Renewal in New York, and has done fantastic work for them. And I've actually met his parents, who are great Catholic parents and are so supported to have not just a vocation come out of the family, but a religious vocation in the Franciscans. And the dad kind of explained, we're excited for it. This is such a boon for our family, boon for our faith. It just would have been better if he'd have done this his freshman year of engineering school rather than senior year. So by this time, there was a big change at A&M. Father Mike Siss had left. He was going to take on the big challenge of vocations, and it was really just a job swap. The vocation director, Father David Condola, was going to come in and see to the needs of all the students at A&M, which is a considerable size parish. At that time, about 12,000 students. Now, they're averaging, I think, 15 to 16,000. These are just the Catholics on campus of a very large university. But Father David Condola did very well to continue the support of the vocations and to support a lot of the other programs and activities that the students were getting involved in. By this time, there was a lot going on, and the priests, while intimately involved, really didn't have to do a whole lot. To understand it, you need to realize we have thousands, literally thousands of highly educated, highly motivated students at a university that's known for producing people who do things, who are active, who get things done. And so they come up with these ideas, they approach the pastor with them. Both Father Sis and Father Condola, who said that is a great idea, make it happen. Meaning they weren't placing projects at the feet of their pastor hoping they get done, they were running with them. Programs like 40 Days for Life. I wasn't Catholic or in RCA at the time, but I'd heard about it, this new idea, a very interesting idea of a prayerful presence for 24 hours a day, 7 days a week for the 40 days of Lent. This was, I think, in Father Condola's first year as a pastor there. And it was a very unique idea, and there wasn't a whole lot of enthusiasm for it at first. But that was the start of 40 Days for Life. Father David never had to come sit in a car or stand in front of the clinic in Bryan, which we were protesting, which we now own. He had all these students jumping at the chance to be active and involved. And in fact, one of their first 40 Days for Life events, Easter was very early that year, so it was very cold. So a lot of the young people, especially over the night shifts, would stay in a heated car. And so one of my good friends, David Araby, who became really one of the catalysts for the growth of the faith there within campus ministry, he was there with a friend in this pickup truck, and they were there all night. And the local police had gotten a call, and so they came by and addressed these young men, and the police said, we've had some reports that there are some suspicious-looking individuals hanging out in front of this Planned Parenthood facility. And David Araby is just one of those quick-witted souls who said, officer, we've been here all night. We haven't seen anybody like that. But that's where 40 Days for Life got started. And so not long afterwards, I myself was introduced to that ministry. And while I didn't know it at the time, that was one of the many causes that really had me looking more directed at a life of vocations. So with this, I became Catholic in 2005. My relationship with a young woman ended, which was a good thing. She wasn't, again, very active in the faith, and our future together was very much unsure. So my future was still unsure. Since the military was no longer going to be an option for me, I went to the field that I was at least somewhat familiar with, natural resources. I took a job as a directional driller, MWD, which really we drill very expensive, very fancy holes for natural gas extraction. It's not a particularly difficult line of work. You deal with some interesting people, and you're often away for considerable amounts of time. So I would be on location for the duration of the project, and I would come home when it was done. So that could be anywhere from 2 weeks to 60 days or more, just depending. But during this time as well, I was really getting much more involved in philanthropy and volunteering for different organizations. That's really been a staple in my life, seeing these opportunities for helping others. I've always jumped at those opportunities, and I've been very lucky to have lots of experience in many different areas of what will become, for me, ministry. So things like Habitat for Humanity. I've probably built a dozen homes across 3 states with that fine organization. The Boys and Girls Club in Lufkin, Texas. I was working there briefly right out of college, and my first day of work, I checked in, got my email set up, met all my new bosses, and discovered that unless I did something quickly and radically, I was going to be bored to death and my faith would suffer. So my second day of work there, I went to the Boys and Girls Club with no experience and no history with the organization. And I said, I'm working here in town. I'm a sane individual. I can pass any background check you want. Can I help out with these kids? And the director at the time, Coach Pat, just a quintessential African-American community leader, very involved. He says, come after work today. We'll see how it goes. So after work, there I was in my business casual attire playing dodgeball with 75 kids, averaging a range between, I think, 3-year-old and 12 years old. So fell in love with that type of work and continued that for the rest of my stay in the city of Lufkin. I got transferred to our new office in San Antonio, and what an opportunity for a new start. So I got into homeless ministry. SAM Ministries in San Antonio is one of the largest homeless shelters in the world, and I got to be in and familiar with that. All the different parts, not positions of leadership, not positions of authority or anything. These were pretty low-level basic volunteer things, which I gravitated to and worked very well with as far as other people. And that's when I started realizing that coming in from a very specific direction, A&M is known for kind of a political leaning, and so the Catholic Student Center, it mirrors that in a lot of ways. But being involved in so many areas of ministry, seeing that the Catholic Church is not well, it's a much bigger tent than most people can appreciate. There's quite a bit of room for everybody to do fantastic works for others, for the church, for God himself. And so falling trapped to some of these old, tired discussions and controversies really does us no good. We focus more on the work at hand, then really great things can happen, at least in my experience. With oil field work going well, although we were about to approach a major decline in 2009. And again, as a third generation in the oil patch, we see these things coming. We've weathered any storm imaginable for the past 50 years, my family. 70 years, sorry, going back to 55. And so it seemed like a right time to have a change in direction. So by that point, all of my bosses were in the Houston area. I was working in Oklahoma and North Texas, and I was in deep discernment, prayerful discernment at this point. But strangely enough, thinking back to this part of life, it wasn't a priest who first approached me about a vocation. It was a parishioner in Marlow, and it was a couple of them at the time. And that really shows the importance of the Serra Club and the importance of pew-sitting Roman Catholics, an effect you can have on the vocation of others. It planted a seed in me. It really did, despite what my response was. And I can't really remember what my response was. It was definitely to the negative. No, I'm not called to that. And, can't think of a worse life living alone and doing church work. But it got me thinking about it. Now, when I talk about the vocations being a culture at A&M, that was still that still remains the case today. In fact, in the highlight of their years, in the 20 that I've been associated with them as a product of their RCA program, one year we had 12 guys go off to seminary, 8 guys the next year, 10 guys the next year, not to mention the young women joining religious communities all over the place, both the Dominicans in Lufkin, big presence there, the Nashville Dominicans, and on top of that, we start seeing the leadership and ministerial life being recognized by the larger church. Father Mike Sis became Bishop Mike Sis, ordinary of the Diocese of San Angelo. Father David Conla, to many people's surprise, was made Bishop of Tulsa. And I remember that day we were in town for a funeral. The Archbishop was there, and I'm still pretty low on the totem pole, which is exactly where I like to be. But it was a strange moment when I got a tap on the shoulder that morning when it was just announced that Archbishop Coakley wanted to see me. And first I thought, well, what have I done now? But I go in and see him, and he looked at me and he says, Archbishop Coakley, he says, do you know this priest from College Station? I said, well, he was my pastor. I was his first confirmandi coming in. He was new in his role as pastor, and he just kind of nods his head, and then Archbishop says, how do you pronounce his last name? That was really what the crux of the conversation was. I said, well, we always knew him as Father Condola, so that was my attempt at the time. But since then, life has been incredible for me. It was a big decision of actually deciding which diocese to join, because I show up at a diocesan event in Fort Worth, Texas. By all rights, I could have applied for the Diocese of Austin, which is where College Station is located. But by this point, having traveled around so much and seeing the life of the church in this region of the nation, I could see and recognize the severe shortage of priests that the Archdiocese of Oklahoma City had. And while, again, having a transitory life early on, Oklahoma was all, for intents and purposes, my home. And so I knew that if I decided to be a priest, and should I be sent to Frederick or to Altus or to Ponca City, these are places I know and am familiar with and could get along well with the people there. So that really instigated my decision in 2009 to leave work, which freaked out my family to no end, and embark on 6 years of education and formation. That concluded in 2015. I was ordained for this archdiocese by Archbishop Coakley and did 3 years as the associate at St. Francis of Assisi. Now in my 4th year as pastor at Sacred Heart in El Reno and St. Joseph's in Union City, running a Catholic school, which has been incredibly interesting and difficult at times, but incredibly rewarding as well, if not for the fact that the kids are fantastic. In fact, we have right now 3 kids older students. We only go up to grade 6 right now, but they have stopped me and they've made the proposal. Father, can we become Roman Catholic as well? So at that point, I have to temper my enthusiasm and let them know that yes, you've achieved the age of reason. You can become Catholic. It also necessitates some good conversations with their parents and family so that we do things proper and we let the child know that this is your adult decision to make. So getting to be there and part of those conversations has been absolutely incredible. So with just a couple of minutes left before we can go upstairs and get ready for Mass. I'm afraid I can't stay for Mass. I had it this morning at my mission church in Union City, a beautiful little church, and then I'm off to it this afternoon. But do you have any questions for me about anything I've discussed?
Just one more. When you did confirmation class with us at St. Francis, the kids connected so well with you. These high school students connected so well with you. I remember you one particular class when you were teaching the Sacrament of Holy Orders, and you talked about how great a gig this priesthood is, and you talked about your truck, and you talked about, you know, you can save money and all that kind of stuff. Do you see kids in Sacred Heart that have that same kind of outlook where that appeals to them and they hear them? Is that a universal way to play with kids, or do the outside of the city kids think different?
That's interesting, and a lot of it depends on the kid, where they're from, and their own personal stories. So I think, yeah, the size and location of parish does adjust my interactions with kids, but in the end, I found success with young people really in just having conversations that are more, they sound more peer-oriented, realizing that there is a power dynamic. I'm the adult, they're the student, but when they can hear a more familiar tone and they can feel appreciated, they gravitate towards that. So that's what I try to do, and it's interesting. I'm having much more success with my elementary and middle school kids in my new assignment than my high school. My high school is in confirmation. We can't get word out in any way. We've done this for half a year now, and we still can't get much out of them. But as far as making the priestly life, or even just the idea of a seminary life, or even the religious life, appetizing to a young person, they're like most people. They are like all people. They want deep meaning in their life. And so they're looking for an area that assigns meaning. Now, what culture puts in as important in meaning can be a very different thing. Right now, material wealth is very important. So we have this, just across the board, this endless appetite for increasing wealth in any way that we can. So we have this, explosion of social media presence because it's become monetized. A young person become insanely wealthy doing that. So you have a lot of kids trying that, but it's such a fickle market and the success rate is so low. So it's trying to get kids, one, just to start looking at what do they want out of life and where they can start looking in life to find that. With the priesthood, there is that built-in sense of meaning, sense and security, in that it would be very unusual for a diocesan priest to be moved outside of their diocese, maybe for a continuing education, but I can expect to live and spend my life in ministry in this archdiocese. And other ways to attract young people is letting them see the effect it can have on other people's lives, because they can see this effect in social media. These celebrities and these personalities, they can have such a wide voice. And so they're wanting that too, but realizing they can have that at a much more intimate level and a more local level. So we have a difficult proposal to make to be able to even consider this, but it's worth making that proposal despite what their immediate reaction or response would be. But it's, again, planting that seed so that it can have time to germinate and really grow, so that the young person on their own initiative can start looking into the life, because it really has to focus on that. One of the worst things to deal with is parents who really want a priest or a religious out of the family, but they don't want to but the kids don't want to be a priest or religious in the family. And that can be a very difficult course to maneuver.
Father Warren, you expressed at the beginning of your talk how Father Mike and Father David were such an influence in your early role as a Catholic. And the ministry itself, the campus ministry at Texas A&M, was a huge part in that process.
Mm-hmm.
In our diocese, we have the University of Oklahoma, we have the University of Central Oklahoma, SWASU, other places. Any kind of couple thoughts before we head up to Mass on kind of what we as Serrans or we as volunteers that are Catholic, who love and support the church, what we can do to help those ministries build the culture?
I think a lot more work can be done in fostering vocations culture, especially on college campuses at any level. And we're not going to recreate the unique situation at A&M because we don't have so many residential colleges to work with here. OUs are exception to that. Whereas we've got a community college, Redlands Community, and UCO. Others, they're very, they're the commuter colleges. But there are things that can be done, just events that can be put on very simply, offer food. If you want to get college students, offer food. Even a cheap t-shirt, huge draw. I probably threw away 24 t-shirts just from 1 year of school. So having a presence there and just offering something that may or may not include the local pastor. I was approached in my first days of El Reno, hey, can you do something on campus at the community college? Would love to. I have no staff, and I can't do it myself. So again, Serra Club is incredibly important, not just for putting a face for vocation work, but the work that you can go out and do. And these don't have to be big events, but it's providing material and an opportunity to meet and have those conversations, the fruits of which we won't see really for years. This is a very long-term approach. Think of it as an investment. So the more we invest just on simple presence on campuses with very minimal effort can have long-term success. So I think meals and opportunities to meet with priests, dynamic priests, the Father Brian Bittness of the world, Father John Pauls, many others, and many of ours from international. Father Ling Bui has a fantastic vocation story of his struggles with coming out of a nation where his was literally a flight to survive with his family. And now here he is in the Archdiocese of Oklahoma City serving as a priest. What young person, especially another international young person, hearing that wouldn't be inspired to at least entertain the idea of priesthood?
Thank you very much, Father.
You're welcome, guys.